Welcome to my new reloading room. Over the last couple of years, when I've made a video, I would usually film parts of it out in my backyard. But now that I've got this space, I think I might record a little bit more in here. And speaking of video ideas, I came up with a video idea recently that will hopefully turn into maybe a series of videos. And let me explain to you how that came about. As I've gotten this room organized, I realized that I've got some equipment lying around that really wasn't doing anything. And so I thought, well, there's probably a pretty good way to deal with this stuff. So let me explain to you what I've had kind of laying around and gathering dust. The first thing is this White Oak Distinguished Rifleman scope. I bought this last year. Not because I had any plans for it, but just because I had the opportunity to buy it. And sometimes I buy stuff for high power that isn't something that I want to use immediately, but I thought it might be a good idea to buy it. So I picked up this scope, and I've only taken it out of the box a couple times. But most of the time it's been sitting in a cabinet and just gathering dust. So that seemed like a bit of a waste. So I thought I should probably do something with it. The other piece of equipment that I've had lying around doing nothing is this. This is a White Oak Armament flat top upper. And I won this last year at the High Power National Championships at Camp Atterbury. I was the high civilian using a service rifle in an aggregate of the 600-yard matches. So there were 3 600-yard matches. And so this was donated by White Oak Armament, so I won it. But I've got other uppers, so I just had this in my safe, and it really wasn't doing anything. So I thought, well, might as well put it to use. And the idea that I had for these pieces of equipment that aren't doing anything is to build a dry fire upper. Now it may seem a bit wasteful to just build something just to dry fire, but I don't know, I had really nothing better to do with this stuff, so I thought that that's what I would do. In the long term, I could potentially use this upper not just for dry firing, but also to take it to the range and shoot matches with it. And the White Oak Armament scope, while I don't have any experience with it, and I'm very happy with my Leupold FX2, maybe there's some aspects to it that I could use, and I could see that it might have an advantage, and I could use that. So anyway, let's get started. Now, one thing I still needed was a way to mount that scope to the upper. I had this, which is a rail with a pair of Weaver 1-inch rings. But from exchanging some text messages with John Holliger at White Oak, this wasn't going to do the job because I needed 30mm rings for the White Oak scope. So he sent me some suggestions of a way I could mount that scope, and I came to the conclusion that probably the best solution for me would be what's in this box. So let's take a look. Okay. Well, it feels good to not be in front of the camera anymore. Let's open up the box and see what we got. Surprise, surprise, it's a 30mm Geisley scope mount. Here's the instruction booklet with the order of assembly. Now, before I could put on any of the new stuff, I wanted to get a baseline for where my existing scope was. So I took a scale and I measured from the back of the scope, my existing Leupold scope, to the back of the upper. And I would use that as a starting point. The first step is to take the upper off of the lower. And then we go get the new upper and take all the packaging off of it. That's a pretty scary looking knife, so kids, don't try this at home. And there it is, your typical flat top service rifle upper. And now for ease of handling, for the next steps, I'm just going to attach it to my lower and be just so I can set it down in my cleaning cradle. At this point, I'm going to take the new Geisley mount and put it on top of my upper. This is really a guesstimate as far as position, because I don't know quite exactly where the scope is going to go, or rather, I'll know approximately where the scope is going to go, but the mount itself, I'm just guessing at. So I'm just going to put it on temporarily and then take off the top half of the rings. Now let's take a look at the contents of this box. It took me a few seconds there to figure out how to open up this fancy magnetic box. Looks like an instruction manual with a battery. This looks to be some kind of quality control checklist. All right, let's put some of this stuff back before we start messing with the scope. All right, looks pretty good so far. Lots of fancy dials, high tech, and it even comes with scope caps. I carefully drop the scope in the mount. And now I'm going to use the scale to try and match this scope position to the scope position that I had with my Leupold. My initial guess for the mount wasn't quite good enough. So the scope has to come off, and then I'll take the mount and just move it forward a little bit. After positioning the mount, the scope goes back on, and we do our measurement again. That's pretty close at this point, at least close enough to where I can get in a position and check the eye relief from the actual shooting positions. Now the top halves of the rings go back onto the mount, and we just snug them down enough to just hold the scope in position while we check the eye relief. The last step in getting the rifle ready is to put my sling back on. And that's it. She's all ready to go, and we can try evaluating the scope position. Because I'm setting this up as a dry fire upper, it's not super critical that I get everything perfect, but I do want to make sure that the eye relief is correct in all three shooting positions, standing, sitting, and prone. So I'm going to put on my shooting coat and my glove and my glasses, all that stuff, and put myself into all three positions with the rifle. And of course, I have to keep the Chips Ahoy people happy. The first position we'll evaluate is prone. So I've got my single load magazine, or my bobsled rather, and I put the sling on my shoulder and then get into position. Of course, you always want to make sure that the rifle is unloaded. I shoulder the rifle, breathe a few times, and then I try to move my head around a little bit to try and see if I have any problems with the eye relief, if that image has got too much black around it in the scope, or if I feel like I'm too close to the scope. Here's my attempt at trying to reach for the windage knob with the rifle in my shoulder. That didn't work out so well. Not that it's absolutely necessary because I don't really do that in prone, but I was just kind of curious. Now I'm just kind of playing with the scope position, just trying to see how that eye relief changes, if at all, by pushing the scope forward and then moving it back. All right, well, pretty good so far. Looks like I think we're okay here in prone. Our next attempt is here in sitting. Check out my attempt at a Julius Erving skyhook here with the mitt. Once again, I get into position, breathe a couple of times, and then move my head around a little bit, back and forth, side to side, just to see how much wiggle room I've got with that eye relief. A quick sling adjustment to get a better shoulder position for the rifle, and back to kind of moving that head around again, just trying to see if I've got some allowance there for the eye relief. And now the final position of standing. This is really going to be probably the primary position that I'll be dry firing in. So this is kind of the one that I want to make sure that the eye relief and everything really about the way I look through the scope is the way that I like it. That didn't take very long because it turns out the position of the scope is actually pretty good now, based on its position from the other, from standing or from prone and sitting. So now that we've got the fore-aft position for the scope ironed out, now we've got to make sure that it's rotationally positioned properly. And for this, I'm going to use a small level. I'm going to put it on the back of the upper, and then I'm going to level the rifle. And once the rifle is level, then I'm going to level the scope. That looks pretty good for the rifle. And that's pretty good for the scope, I think. You could certainly go in circles trying to do this, going back and forth between the rifle and the scope. I don't think it's really necessary to get it perfect. It's not so much that the scope has to be level. It's that if you do shoot with a cant, that your cant is consistent from shot to shot within a given position. With the scope in the right position, now it's time to tighten the rings. You could certainly torque these down with a torque wrench, but the Geisley manual for the mount says that it's perfectly acceptable to just hand tighten them. So that's what I'm going to do. Once the rings are tightened, we throw the level on top of the scope and the rifle just as a double check. I like to go back over the screws and just a double check to make sure that I've got these things tightened down properly. And so the last step is to just make sure that the mount itself is tightened down to the rail on the upper. Once again, the manual from Geisley says that you could torque these down with a torque wrench, but it's not necessary. Hand tightening is acceptable, especially for this, which is a dry fire application. So there you have it. The rifle has got a scope mounted to it, and it's ready to go. Well, almost. I still have to. I've got to focus the scope for my eyes, which I can do another day. But after that, I can start dry firing with it. see what that looks like. What I'll do is I'll make some videos of some of my dry firing sessions, and I've got a couple ideas about how maybe I can make those a little bit interesting for people to watch. So stay tuned for that. Thanks.